There's something that you can do to radically improve your knowledge of music theory, of orchestration, and just understanding how music works. And you can do it even if you don't have a teacher at the moment. And we're going to talk about that next. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 16 of the Musician Toolkit. I am your host, David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. I'm personally very excited about today's episode, and I feel like some of you are also going to be as excited as I am. But some of you may be coming in, maybe you've heard other episodes, or maybe this is your first episode. And I might have to persuade you of why to stick around, because I could perceive how it might come across as overtly, for lack of a better word, overtly nerdy. And that might be saying something for a podcast that really gets into the nuts and bolts of all kinds of aspects of musicianship. As I said at the very beginning of this episode, there is something that you can do. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do, but there's one thing specifically that even if you don't have a teacher right now, or you're not sure when you will have a teacher to guide you, that can teach you so much about how music is put together, and that is the art of score study. You may have seen some of the video excerpts from previous episodes, or maybe you watch these on YouTube. Maybe you're watching right now. If so, you've noticed that in my background, I have a couple of bookshelves. And right on the one that's closest to the door, top shelf, those are all orchestral scores. And some of them, and actually there's about 4 shelves from the top. There's a bunch of smaller ones. These are all study scores, probably about a third to half the height of the bigger scores that I have. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about score study. Now, score study falls under a bigger umbrella of something that you can do in musicianship that we would just call analysis. And there's specific things you can do. You can take a solo violin piece, one staff. You can take jazz lead sheets. You can take any kind of music from any genre, and you can choose something to analyze about it. And a lot of times when we say analysis in music, we're talking specifically about functional harmony. Well, maybe if it's not a traditional classical style piece, we might say not functional harmony, but just identifying what are the chords. We might also get into certain types of pieces and talk about the melodic material and how it's been used and how it's been manipulated, what kind of variations there are with it. And so when you consider all the things that you can do and all the things that you can learn by looking at a score and all the types of genres there are, this is probably the first of many episodes that we'll have on this subject on the life of the podcast. But today I wanted to talk about specifically orchestral scores. Obviously, if you are a conductor, there's a huge benefit to getting as many scores as you can and looking at them and seeing what the orchestra is doing and so forth. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I specifically want to reach out to those who, of course, one of the tools is the ability to compose. And again, you might not consider yourself a composer with a capital C or an arranger with a capital A. But I promise you, if you excel in musicianship, there's going to be times where you're going to wish, if you don't already, that you had the ability to take a piece of music and arrange it for an ensemble. And someone might say, hey, could you add some woodwinds to that, or some brass, or some strings, or percussion? Or maybe someone says, hey, my orchestra will play something you'll write. I like this thing that you've done for your instrument. There's a lot of possibilities out there. So one of the things that is often taught in school is the art of orchestration. And there are 2 great ways to learn orchestration by yourself. Both of them involve listening to pieces from orchestra, but the first one is listening to pieces from orchestra in addition to reading text books on orchestration. The second common way, though, and the way that most composers probably in the history of the world have ever done, is listening to music in addition to looking at the written scores and making observations about what's there and how it works and why it works. So for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to primarily be talking about orchestral scores, primarily from the perspective of someone who would like to learn it to be able to duplicate the results themselves. And I couldn't think of anybody better to talk to about this than my friend of over 25 years, Andrew Callo. Andrew was a classmate and a very good friend from my final 2 years of university education at University of North Carolina School of the Arts. We were both in the same class studying film scoring together, and he is an accomplished composer in his own right. We'll talk about some of the things that he has written, some of the things that he's arranged, and and some of the things that he still does musically. But I brought him on because of all the things that we talked about that have stuck with me through multiple decades, what has stuck with me probably the most is a lot of great conversations that we had about studying scores, what kind of scores, some of the things that we learned from it. And so I thought it'd be great to have him on, and we're going to reminisce about some of the things that we talked about before, and then we're going to go forward from there. And what I hope that you'll learn from this, whether you're a beginner at composing an orchestration or whether you've done quite a bit yourself, we're going to talk about how you can obtain some scores. What are some of the things that you can do? What strategies can you take in learning things from the score? And I'll give you a hint, some of them not only include your knowledge of theory, but also improving your ear training. We're going to talk about some recommended scores that you check out, especially if you're a beginner, some ones that you can get started with that are maybe not as intimidating as others. Also, just a special note, if you are watching this on YouTube, you will not hear any musical excerpts that go along with some of the scores that we talk about. But if you listen to the podcast episode, you can hear those as well. All right, it's a bit of a long conversation. And again, I hope I can persuade you to stay the whole time because I enjoyed every bit of it. And I think every bit of it is valuable if you really want to take your musicianship to the next level, regardless of whether or not you consider composing and arranging the primary thing that you do. Here is my conversation with my friend, Andrew Callo. It's my pleasure today to be talking to my friend from way back, who we've really only recently connected in person earlier this year. I guess it was earlier this month. Or last month, right?
Yeah, it was last month.
Right. But Andrew, welcome to the podcast. It's great to talk to you today.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's good to talk to you and to see you again. It's like old times.
Andrew and I are 2/3 of the class of 1999 film scoring class at North Carolina School of the Arts. We entered when it was only 2 years old, so I'm not sure how many more students that they take, but yeah, we went through the 2-year program, and I'm sure in a different episode we could have all kinds of stories about not only what we learned from that, but the roller coaster of trying to make that work as a career.
Yeah. Yep, it's quite a roller coaster.
So besides, sharing 2 years of classes together, and I feel like we had basically every class together, which was like completely different than any, that was the fun thing about graduate school. There might have been one class or, where we didn't have the same thing. But besides that, we hung out quite a bit and we had a lot of conversations about all kinds of things, but especially related to music and film music and composing and so forth. And one of the topics that we shared quite a bit of conversation about that I don't think I've really had on an equal measure with anybody else is score study. And this is something that I think so many musicians are missing out on by not taking time, either a few times a month or once a week or however much they can devote to it to do that. I think conductors, most professional conductors, of course, do it for what they're about to conduct. They have to go through it, and how much may depend on the conductor. It may be just preparing cues and what they're going to be listening for and so forth. But we'll get into that for some conductors. But before we before we dive into that subject, though, just tell us a little bit about yourself and just maybe last few years, especially as a composer and what you've been doing musically.
Well, after I got my bachelor's degree over at JMU, I auditioned for the Air Force Band as a clarinetist, and I got in and was stationed over in Ohio and Germany. And I did 8 years as a performer on clarinet and occasionally doing a solo. And I also started doing a lot of arranging. They had a staff arranger at the time there, but he was primarily occupied with the jazz band and the rock band. They had so much demand for him. So when the concert band, more symphonic stuff, he didn't have much time for that. So they employed some of my abilities to get in there and get some of the work done. And that's where I learned to do transcriptions, taking orchestra pieces and writing them for band and learning from the mistakes there, doing medleys, um, taking commercial sounding works and creating band arrangements for them, vocal medleys, patriotic songs, and
I want to
just, I mean,
interject. There's a piece you did that I still remember, and I was really impressed at your work. And you did almost, I believe, was the incomplete "How the Grinch Stole Christmas" arranged for
yes,
band.
yes, we did. There was no printed arrangement of it at the time. And all I had was a cassette tape with a player that could slow fast passages down. And I had my keyboard and I had a sketch pad.
Mm,
And I would listen and listen and listen and write that all down, put all the vocal parts in. And then the laborious part of loading it all into Finale, which was working 12 hours a day to get that put in
mm.
and get it arranged, uh, clearing up some issues with the percussion section with the percussionists, having them come in and listen to the recording and giving me advice on how to notate certain things, and it was that was quite a task. But when it came out, it was beautiful.
Yes.
It was absolutely beautiful, and they're still playing
Mhm.
even now. And that was 1996. They're still playing it now. So yeah, that was the big one. And then I did an original piece for the 50th anniversary of the Air Force called Warbirds and Warriors, which I believe the Air Force you can find on Spotify.
Mhm.
And there's another work that's not yet recorded officially, but I have a performance of it, a Man of the Century, where we took the there was a some notes from Colin Powell regarding the GI, the American GI, an essay he kind of wrote.
Yeah.
We took excerpts of that and I scored original music to it. And one thing that got me with it, it was originally there was another band that took those excerpts and used selections, an arrangement of Saving Private Ryan,
Mhm.
and it worked. But Private Ryan, it was not written for that particular text. Parts of it worked really well, and then parts of it didn't. So I took it and I rewrote my own version specifically around the text, and that went very well. It's very different. I'm not comparing myself with John Williams or anything like that, but I it worked well with the text because it was specifically designed for that work.
Right. So let's go ahead and just get into the main topic today. We're going to be talking about score study. Again, this was something that we chatted a lot about, and there's some things that you kind of shared with me, and I'll mention as they come up. But
Okay.
I thought about, you know, the we're talking about score studying in general. Let's maybe just kind of talk about some of the ways you might use score study. So, some of the ways that I came up with is obviously if you're a conductor, it helps you see what everybody's playing, and also, where are the challenges going to be in rehearsal? What are the lines that you're going to need to coach? You're going to need to bring out. Also, in a larger scope, what are you going to do with the tempos and so forth? So that's one thing. The other thing is if you are going to be a composer or an arranger of any kind, there's no better way to learn orchestration. You can obviously there are plenty of great orchestration textbooks, but actually seeing what great orchestra pieces do, with the written score is definitely something. You can also use it for learning harmonies and other compositional devices. Could argue that might be better to do that in piano music, but sometimes composers think differently for orchestral pieces than they do for small scale. And let's start with those. There was a fourth one I came up with, but what how have you used score study in general, just kind of broad terms over the years? What are some of the things that you've used in score study to learn about music?
With score study, I usually have a specific purpose for what I'm looking for when I do score study. It's either a piece that I really like
Mhm.
and I hear sounds in it, or I hear harmonies that I can't decipher in my head. And this is something that I do with Stravinsky scores.
Right.
Things like the Rite of Spring and Petrushka and the Firebird, and just about basically anything that I like that he wrote,
Mhm.
because he broke with tradition and created his own harmonic language and an orchestration to fit that. So he pretty much created something brand new. And it's not, to me, his writing is not instinctive. And so I delve in to try to take apart the things I like that are not instinctive.
Yeah.
But that's on a more advanced level of writing.
Right.
But in terms when I got started, um, I was trying to learn just basically how to take something that I wrote on piano
Mhm.
and flesh it out for orchestra.
Right.
And I came across what got me started with it. And this is how I get into, we were talking about Beethoven in the
Right.
past. And Beethoven just happens to be my go-to for any beginning orchestrator, composer. And what I did was one time I was in the music store in Harrisonburg and I came across two volumes of Beethoven symphonies for piano, in two volumes here by Otto Singer. And what he did was he took all the symphonies and condensed them into two line piano music. Now, I've read through them and tried to play them, and they're not really playable. So I don't think he really wrote them for performance. If you're going to perform out of this book, you're going to need to do some editing because you have cross voicings and you have chords that you don't have six fingers. You just
Right.
can't do
Right.
it. And leaps that just don't work.
Yeah.
So I decided to start with the easiest work, and I went to the first symphony.
Mhm.
And the very first symphony it's fantastic because it opens up, the first 8 bars open up with a big wind choir playing these chords. And I found it on piano and I was listening to it, and then I went to another music store and found the Dover books that had all the symphonies. And I had those books side by side. Right, right. And I had the sixth and seventh symphony right here.
Cool.
But yes, so I opened that and I saw how the idea from the piano was expanded onto the score.
Right.
So I copied that.
Mhm.
And what I did was created a condensed score and took that down and wrote that out. Just basically copied what he did onto a 3 line score
Right.
and compared it. And then I went to the next movement. I listened to it. I looked at the piano score and then I tried to do the reverse and try to flesh it out to
Mm.
see how close I would get to what he wrote. And
Yes.
there were some areas that shocked me. I was like, wow, I actually got good at this. And then there were others I was like, oh, wait a minute. I didn't do that right at
Right.
all. And that's kind of my self-taught version of orchestration. So when I was in my junior year and we took the orchestration class, I already had a lot of this stuff down that the other students were struggling with.
Right. Yeah. And, I think orchestration classes, it can be valuable, if you have an opportunity, anybody listening, definitely, especially if you have a good teacher on that, because they can help guide your ear to certain things. Like, when we start talking about, and I think when we talk about strings, I think we're mostly talking about what's good for each instrument, so I think those as a family, that's pretty simple. But when we start talking about woodwinds, we're talking about a large family of instruments with different timbres, and
Right.
things, problematic things like, your flute in the lowest end of its register is very soft, but on the high end of the register, it's very loud. But the opposite is true of the oboe.
Right.
Oboe is just very honky, just piercing at the bottom, so it's like if you have a unison line low, you're only gonna hear the oboe, and if you have it high, you're only gonna hear the flute. So, kind of there's a lot of things like that. Also, it's interesting to like some techniques. So how do you combine these different sounds? And, I'm a big fan of I don't have the book handy, it's probably on the shelf behind me, but it's, by Kent Keenan Orchestration, Technique of Orchestration. But it
I have that
uses
book.
yeah, it uses some terms like sandwiching, I think is what it is, like,
Hmm.
where you could like, if you have 2 clarinets, 2 oboes, you could put, like, the clarinets between the oboes or the oboes between the clarinets, and then you could also I don't know what you call it, like, clarinet, oboe, if you're going from bottom to
Hmm.
top, but there's a bunch of things in there that are like that where it's very handy. But if you kind of know that those exist, you can find them by looking at examples. Like if you hear a great wind sound, like you mentioned at the beginning of the first symphony, you can see what Beethoven chooses to do to combine those winds together.
Hmm.
So yes, using it for orchestration. We talked about for conductors, and again, you can use it for learning harmonies and other
Hmm.
compositional devices. One of the things I didn't pull it out on my stack here, but maybe something like the Passacaglia by Anton Webern, which if you're listening and Webern scares you off, that's the one work he did before he really got into dissonance, and it's actually it's cutting edge late romantic work. But what he does with the melody, he doesn't
Hmm.
just write a melody, but he passes it around.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a fourth level thing you can do. It's with score study, is if you wanna level up on your sight reading game, you've
Oh
got
yeah.
piano stuff, um, I and we're t I feel like we're talking about orchestral scores, but maybe find some chamber music or, like, some string quartet scores. That might be interesting because, for the most part, it's 4-part texture, maybe occasionally an 8-part texture. And you can do that with your hands. You might have to arpeggiate some things, but just reading between the staffs, and then, of course, also, and we'll talk about, like, what are some of the challenges of it, but you might, if you're a pianist, for example, or just about any other player in the orchestra or vocalist, you're probably used to treble and or bass clef. And
Hmm.
so all you have to do is go to a string quartet and you'll see something different in the violas. You'll see the alto clef. And if the cellos are not staying down low, then you're probably going to see something that almost looks like alto clef, but it's tenor clef.
Hmm.
And then, one of the things talking about Beethoven, have fun when you look at the Ninth Symphony and the vocals, because they've got, the treble and bass clef are, I think at some point we said enough's enough, put it in one spot. But they used to move around, and you have and the C clefs especially would just move all over the place.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of transposition involved. So I guess let's just go ahead and get into the challenges. So one of the challenges is, even if you're just going slow, if you're looking at orchestral pieces, there's a lot of staves to read. And by the way, I
Hmm.
just throw as an aside, some people say staves not a real word, it's staffs. But I don't know. I'm not going to fight that battle. I'll call it staves.
No, not worth it.
But you have a lot of staves to read. I'll just open up, since we're talking about the First Symphony of Beethoven. Now, this is probably not so intimidating. there are 11 staves on that first page. So you got,
Hmm.
but that's helped by the fact that up to a point, and maybe you've noticed at what point it changes, but most of Beethoven's symphonies will put the cello and the bass on the same staff. I don't know at what point it became standard to separate those parts.
Well, I think it was generally later in the 19th century when the cellos were really doing a lot of different music, different parts from the bass,
Right.
instead of constantly doubling. And that throws back to 18th century music where the cello was nearly always doing
Right.
doubling. It was standard. And even the viola, which I couldn't stand doubling an octave higher.
Right.
I, you know, in Beethoven, he created a separate viola part
Right.
pretty much. And that's what I love about his string writing for the symphonies.
Right.
He's functional viola.
And by the way, what we just said, that's actually why it's called the double bass. It doubles the cello.
Right.
But
Right.
typically, if a cellist and a bassist play the same part, it's going to sound in octaves because the bass is going to sound an octave lower than what's written.
Right.
But yeah, just looking, the flutes are on one line, the oboes are on one line, clarinets are on one line, bassoons are one line. Um, and one of the other challenges, I mean, this is just a 7-note score, but maybe if I was to pull out something like The Planets by Gustav Holst.
Well, that's another one. Yes.
Well, let's see, what do we got here? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 staves for the woodwinds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 staves for the brass. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for the percussion. Two groups of two staves for the harp. A group of two staves for the organ, and five staves for the strings. So, and of course, if you can pull out some Debussy, and sometimes you'll see like the first violin splits off into all of these separate
Hmm.
groups of divisi. So, this is a huge score. I'm going to talk more about. I've got a few examples in the planets that I'll bring back up. Um, but back to the Beethoven. One of the other challenges that we have is, if all you ever play is your instrument, you don't really think about this. But I'm looking at this and I see clarinetti. I figured that out. O I can figure that out. Uh,
Hmm.
but then like corny in C. And sometimes oboe, it's like I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but Hautbo,
Hautbois.
oboe.
Hautbois. Hmm.
Yes. So, you have to figure out what these instruments are. One of the things that helps is if you understand a little bit about a score, traditional score order. So let me let you talk for a bit. What is the traditional score order if you don't like mess around with things for an orchestra?
Well, for an orchestra, you have the high end woodwind instruments down to the low end woodwind instruments on the top. So be piccolo, flute, oboe, English horn if you have one, clarinets, um, bass clarinet, bassoon. Well, you would have bass clarinet and bassoon down at the same level there.
Yeah.
And then from there you would move into brass instruments. And because the horn is so integral and used in both woodwind and brass music, it's at the top
Mhm.
of the brass staves.
Yep.
And they have them, I don't know how you call this, dovetailed, ducktailed, where you have one in the first part and the third part
Yep.
and the second and the fourth part are black bracketed together, but they're still labeled 1 through 4.
Yep.
So horn 2 is playing below horn 3.
Yeah.
And I know that has to do with the fact that when they used four horns in 18th century music, because they didn't have valves and they were usually mostly overtone series, that's how they would get complete 4-note chords, by having one in one key, like for example, in F, and the other one would be in B flat.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not necessary today. But I actually like studying those,
Hmm.
because when I'm doing an arrangement or work or orchestration, let's say of a piece from like a Mozart piece or a string piece from that period, and I'm arranging it for a wind octet or 13 winds and I have 2 to 4 horns to try to make it sound like it was from the time period, I will go through the effort to try to voice the horns the way they would have been voiced then.
Yeah.
And the reason I like that is because I like the way they worked around it and how they fit into each chord and in the progression of the music.
Right.
Now, now, obviously, today we don't need to do that. And if I'm doing more modern works or I'm writing my own music, I don't do that at all. You know, those it plays a chromatic scale, I give it whatever it wants.
Right.
Um, so it's not necessary, but it's just an extra step that I take, and it it's it's a personal choice.
Mhm. Yeah. And then let's continue from the
Right.
horn, get down to the
Going down to the trumpets, you'll have 2 to 3 trumpets on average, depending on the size of the orchestra. Then you have trombones. You'll have usually 2 trombones or a bass trombone or 3 trombones. When I write, I like to have 3 trombones and a bass trombone.
yeah.
I like to have the bass trombone down with the tuba
Mhm.
um, from time to time. I just like that sound in octaves and occasionally in unison to give that blatty low sound in loud passages.
Right.
And then we have the percussion, whatever percussion you have. You have timpani, and
Mhm.
then below that you'll have the note the non note percussion, the rhythmic percussion, and then you have the strings, 4 to 5 staves.
Right. And I mean, if we really wanted to take a long time, y- percussionists will actually argue about what they prefer. Do they want like all of the parts on a page, that
Mhm.
they can figure out, or do they want a separate part for each instrument so they can kind of, you know, designate it out to the right section and all that? But so we won't we
Well,
won't.
actually, I can offer some advice on that
Okay.
because most of my writing is with band,
Right.
and bands have huge percussion sections.
Mhm.
And what I do is I'll get with the percussion section leader and I'll give a score with just a percussion section
Mhm.
and I'll give it to them and say, okay, this is where I think they should fall on the lines. What do you think? And they'll go through and they'll say, well, I know this member's here and we have it set up here. And they'll go through and they'll make the little changes and they'll say, this works better. They'll give it back to me and I'll rearrange it to the way they want it and
Mhm.
then hand it back to them and it works beautifully.
Right. Nice.
You let the experts tell you how to do it.
Yes. Mostly, if you're writing music of any kind and it involves drums or percussion, make friends.
Yes,
That
very
way.
important to make friends.
I
They
mean,
will love to talk about their instruments to you all day long.
yep. And I mean, I learned from a drummer. First time I ever had to write for a drum set, said stems down for the feet, stems up for the hands, and I've seen a lot of books that don't do that, and I'm like, I bet that's hard for them.
Hmm.
Hard to figure that out. um So, yeah, and of course, I don't know if we mentioned, like, in between the percussion and strings is, like, everything else. So, harps, organ, piano,
Hmm. Right.
celesta, well, it's just technically percussion, but then, like, choir,
Hmm.
soloists. Actually, I think isn't that if it's a concerto, isn't that normally where you find it right above the strings? I don't have a
Yes.
concerto handy to check, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Right above the strings.
So, and that's a reason I did not even think of for this episode. You might want to do a score study if you are an instrumentalist preparing a concerto. You might have the 4 stave version, but you might want to know exactly what's going on in the orchestra. That could affect your interpretation of how you want to play with them. So, let's also just clarify the difference between the 2 types of orchestra scores that you might see. You have the kind of traditional or transposed score, and then you have what might be called a C score. And they usually, if I'm not mistaken, the C scores will tell you that. It'll tell you that either by C score or
Hmm.
in concert pitch. But, what are some of the things we got to watch out for if it's not a C score?
Well, if it's not a C score and let's say, for example, you're up conducting
Mhm.
and or you're the composer and you're standing there next to the conductor and they want to do a note check.
Yeah.
Okay. Make sure you take a breath and look and make sure your transposition is correct before you tell them the note.
Mhm.
Um, Particularly for me, saxophone. When I have to be looking at the different saxophones, going up a six or the with the alto sax, tenor sax is up a ninth,
Mhm.
and bari sax is treble clef. It's up a ninth and up in treble clef, so it's actually written an octave higher.
Yeah.
You could, and you just have to be careful with that.
Right.
And what I usually do to get around it is I'll give the conductor either a transpose score,
Mhm.
unless he asks for a C score, because sometimes they like the C score. Then
Right.
I'll have a C score next to me.
Mhm.
I'll be holding the C score, and when there's the note check, I'll just give them the note.
Right. I'll go ahead and
Or
offer if you're trying to figure out if you're score studying and you're seeing like clarinet in A or clarinet in B flat, and if they're looking at saxophones and everything is in E flat or B flat, and you've got the French horn in F, I'm going to credit my orchestral conductor from undergrad school, Mr. McNeilin, and he gave us this thing called hand to stand, and that is the instrument in your hand compared to what is on the stand. So if you're trying to say, what would my B flat clarinet be in the if I'm looking at a C score, I have to go up a
Mhm.
step.
Right.
But if I'm at a piano, and what you have to do is if you're trying to analyze the music, you're trying to think in the key of C. You're trying to, and what we mean by the key of C is not that it's in the key of C major, but it's
It's
C.
untransposed.
Yes, C equals C is what we're saying.
Mhm.
So, like, when we're talking about B flat trumpet, B flat clarinet, we're saying that if you write them a C, it sounds like a B flat. And an E flat alto saxophone, their C to them sounds like an E flat to us. So that's a whole another episode someday.
Right.
Might talk about that. But if you're trying to figure out, well, what are they playing? I want to play it on the piano. I want to or on the keyboard. You are thinking in terms of C. So like if you're looking at an F horn, you have to figure out, well, that's either going up a fourth or down a fifth. And in most cases from the piano, you're going to be going down. There's like very few instruments that transpose up, it's
Yes.
piccolo's up an octave, but so just kind of a little general guideline. But yeah, obviously if you're a conductor and you're making corrections, if you're looking at a C score, you're either going to have to say concert pitch, clarify your instructions, or you have to do your transpositions, and just remember hand to stand is kind of a good approach, and
Hmm.
to get to their instrument. So we've talked about some of the benefits of score study, and we might go into a little bit more detail in a moment. But let's talk about where you can find these scores, especially the orchestral scores. So we kind of mentioned I put this up. If you're watching on YouTube, these are clips. This is Dover Publications. They have pretty inexpensive scores, is a way that you can do that. And they've got I haven't even looked at their library in a long time because of another resource I'm gonna mention in just a moment, but really nicely bound and easy to read scores. I also I didn't mention this, but I pulled out if you've my eyesight is not what it used to be, but like this is actual size, just a little taller than my hand. This is one of my larger miniature scores, and being a miniature score, it's designed for study. It's not, it wouldn't be great to conduct from this, but you can at least see what's going on. This is a Hindemith Mathister Mahler score, and I've got quite a few of those, on the shelf behind me, just really tiny, not easy to read, but you can follow them. But something that I've mentioned before in a previous episode is imslp.org, and I mentioned that for sight reading. But there's a lot of orchestral scores there, and surprisingly recent. Like I've almost anything I've looked for by Respighi, I've been able to find it. Um, not a lot by Stravinsky because he did live, pretty deep into the 20th century.
In 1971.
Yep. But early Prokofiev, early Shostakovich, and of course early Stravinsky. But it's basically if it's before about 100 years ago, roughly,
Right.
you can find a score there. Now you have to decide: do I want to print all this out, or are you okay putting it on your screen and a tablet? I guess the problem then, if you do that, is if you can. I mean, it helps if you have an app like Fourscore would be a good one. FORSCORE, where you can annotate. You can pause and you can, use a marker or type text or something like that. Because I think one of the things that really helps with score study is writing things down that you're discovering in the margins below, or in some file that goes with it. That one of the problems I just mentioned is it's hard to find inexpensive scores of more contemporary pieces.
Hmm.
So the best place that I could advise for that would be music libraries at a university. Like almost everything I've ever found that's contemporary has been there. So I I guess you have to check the policies of what it is. It might be that you can go and you have to stay in the library and just get a notebook and write, or take a camera photo of certain passages, or whatever. But if they could let you check it out and you could kind of take more time with it and listen to the music, that's something you can do. Or if money's not an object, you can buy the scores. And I just want to mention this real quick because I am a film music. I mean, obviously, we are both film music fans. It's a great company out there, and every now and then they have some deals, but it's called Omni Publications. It's like full score of Poltergeist here, and they've done a bunch of
And I
score.
don't have, I'm not familiar with OmniPress.
Yeah, Omni Music Publishing, and
Hmm.
they have. I feel like they have a Facebook page, out there,
Hmm.
but they just their latest one is Total Recall, Jerry Goldsmith. They've got a lot of Jerry Goldsmith stuff. I know they have Star Trek: The Motion Picture. They've got quite a few things by James Horner. I don't know that they've ever advertised anything by John Williams, and that could be a rights thing. I don't know if.
It could be,
Yeah. I mean, I
because
mean,
yeah.
unfortunately, James Horner and Jerry Goldsmith are not with us anymore, and that may have something to
No,
do with it.
no, you're right about that.
So, besides the resources I mentioned, have you come across any other sources of finding and collecting scores for orchestra?
Yes, there is the Boozy and Hawks series.
Hmm.
And this is one that I like. I picked it up. It's Bernstein's Orchestral Anthology,
Mhm.
Volume One, and it has three dances from On the Town, symphonic dances from West Side Story. You can get there's a Copeland Orchestral Anthology available. A lot of works by Benjamin Britten, um, Russian orchestral works. Well, but those are the Prokofiev, Lieutenant Kija, Symphonic Suite. This is just some that you can. I'm just thinking about here that are printed on the back. Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, Benjamin Britten, and that's just part of it.
Yeah.
But that's another source, and their scores are more expensive than Dover, but they're reasonable and they're written in large enough print where you can sit down and study them. And one thing I liked about Bernstein is how he combines the jazz into the orchestra,
Mhm. Yeah,
and
nice.
that's why I kind of highlighted that particular score.
Let's transition. Let's talk about some strategies for score study. So, what can you do? You've got the scores. What are some of the things that we can do to get some information from it? I want to just highlight some of the things that you said already, that you did getting started. So one of the ones that you did was a reduction. You looked at the orchestral score and you tried to reduce it down to, I think you said three staves. And I think that's three or four staves is kind of a good number. It's like if you do it to two, you might see everything, but if you have any kind of polyphony going on, it's just really hard to see what's going on. It gets
Mhm.
real cluttered. Um, so that's one of the things that we can do. One of the things that I wanted to mention kind of early in this list is I really think that this was kind of the time honored way of learning composition before getting a university education was more popular. And obviously having a mentor was of course a big help, but a lot of people that like I think if Beethoven was trying to learn how to write, he probably grabbed some Haydn scores or Handel, or, or whatever he could find.
Hmm.
And one of the things that a lot of these composers did was literally write it out on it fresh, just like write out
Hmm.
the flute, write out the oboe. And by doing that, this is one of those things. This could be a whole other topic. People talk about, is it better to, if you're writing a journal, just for example, is it better to type it out or is it better to write it out by hand? And there a lot of psychologists will tell you there's something very powerful about writing it out by hand.
I
Uh,
agree.
so much so that when I compose today, I may not write out every note, but I try to get the main ideas out by hand, and I'll make some text instructions like expand this chord, add some color, and then I'll go to finale and I'll do the work there. But to get the creative nuggets out, that's really helpful. And you watch your hand write all of this out,
Hmm.
and you start to see the tendencies of these instruments and what works and what doesn't. So that is it's time consuming, but that's a literal way to do it. Now, if you're just insistent, you can just go straight into finale or Sibelius or any notation program and do the same thing, open, I'd probably start with about 20 staves and then, expand as needed. One of the things you could also do, just this might be good for just kind of hearing how the process goes together, and probably not hard for anybody who has a DAW like Logic or Digital Performer, Pro Tools, is open up a bunch of MIDI files, for those instruments, or MIDI virtual instruments, like open up your flute, your clarinet, and record each part. And it also might even help you. Now, for most of these, you should be able to handle the transposition. This will give you good practice for that. You can play what's written for the clarinet, just transpose what you're playing down to whole steps. I believe I said that right. And then play what you see, and it'll sound in concert pitch. So that's one of the things you could do.
I've
Yeah.
done that too, where I would record it
Mhm.
and play it off I used Digital Performer with the microphone back in the time, and I would record it, or I would mix it with the synthesizers, and I would isolate lines and hear how it sounded without the rest of the orchestra playing, and that helped. But I found that it didn't give me the results I wanted because I wasn't internalizing the sounds.
Yeah.
It was playing back for me, and it was kind of um, more like a audio candy.
Yeah.
So I was dependent on that to help me listen to the sound rather than putting that concept in my head and being able to hear it. And when I can hear it in my head, I remember it better.
Right. Okay, that's a great point. So there's a couple that we can elaborate on. So one of the things you can also do, I just have a few scores here for an example, but like I'll bring out the planets again, and that is that you can make observations about what you're hearing. So this is the opening of Mars, and this is just what I wrote. I said all of the strings are playing a low G, and they all have the same rhythm. They're playing
Right.
Colania, which is, having looked that up, that's with the side of the bow or the stick part of the bow for a percussive effect. There are two harps playing, and one is going from a low G to a high G. The other one's going from the higher G to the low G. And when you hear them together, it sounds like they're playing in octaves, but
Yes, yes.
very interesting effect. The timpani doubles what the bass is doing. So that's just getting started. And then as soon as there's some harmony in, I notated that it's a D flat major over a G bass resolving to a G chord. And measure 17, at some point I noticed that every wind instrument or every woodwind instrument is playing except for the flutes. So I never really asked myself why, but it was just something that I noticed, that was going on. And made some more comments about the ostinato that's going on, and that's just the first 4 pages of this, but every so often, I'm writing down some
Right.
kind of observation, that, and so this is something you can do, and I've got a bunch of scores, I'm embarrassed to admit, that just have a big circle around a passage and just says color question mark harmonies
Hmm.
question mark, which means I need to go back and figure out what's going on. But that means I listened to it once with the score open, and it's like, this is really neat. I got to go back and figure out what's going on. And some places I have, some places I haven't.
Holst is very interesting
Mhm.
because he was a brilliant orchestrator,
Yeah.
but he at one point was tasked to teach orchestration. I forget exactly where he was teaching in London or wherever he was teaching,
Mhm.
but he tried to teach the course and he couldn't
Hmm.
because for him, he couldn't separate orchestration from composition.
Yeah.
To him, it was so intertwined. He would hear the sounds and say, "Oh, well, these instruments are making these sounds." He would put it down.
Mm.
He didn't like the idea of coming out with like a 4/5 sketch and say, "Okay, well, what instruments am I going to do with this?" He had this instinct. Tchaikovsky was another person. He
Mhm.
has this wonderful orchestration, and when you look at it, it doesn't look like much because he didn't really put a whole lot of thought into it. He was just naturally able to do it.
Mhm.
Same with Debussy. You know, he was asked, "How do you orchestrate?" He says, "Well, watch the leaves fall from the tree in the fall time. Listen to the ocean as it comes walking in. Look, it's all around you. Orchestration is all around you. All you have to do is harness it." But on the other hand, you had people like Hector Berlioz
Mhm.
and Richard Strauss and Maurice Ravel who disagreed and said, "No,
Mhm.
orchestration can be taught."
Yeah.
And there were wonderful orchestrators. One book that I have here, and it's an old one. It's the Treatise of Orchestration by Hector Berlioz,
Mhm.
and it has the 1909 edition by translated and updated by Richard Strauss.
Mm.
And it's a beautiful work, and we know how wonderful those two were as orchestrators. Berlioz was a forerunner of the large orchestra.
Mhm.
I mean, he basically, according to Mendelssohn, put Mendelssohn to bed for 5 weeks ill because the music was so loud and cacophonous that he just couldn't handle it.
Right.
Um, and Strauss, he's such a wonderful orchestrator too. And his book, he takes examples that we can find every day and goes into detail with it. One thing I like about this book is they talk about the strings and the multi-stop. There's a whole section on it.
Yeah.
And when you go through and read it, you will understand, even if you don't play the instrument like I don't, you'll understand how it works.
Yeah.
And with the later books, either Kennan books or the a book in between like Rimsky-Korsakov,
Yeah.
they, they don't talk about that.
Right.
Um,
Since we're talking books, I don't have it because I've never invested in it, but the Bible out there that I've heard the most is Samuel Adler. It's like,
yes, I've heard that. I don't have it either.
yeah, it's a huge book. So I couldn't tell you personally, anything about it, but there are plenty of other resources out there. So things that I mean, I don't even know what's current, among most colleges, when they teach, uh, but there are a lot of resources out there. I want to talk about one other thing you can do with a score, and it's something I never thought about till you told me, and you mentioned it earlier that you did this yourself, and I did this with Debussy on an example, and that's listen to get the score, make sure you've got it so you can check, but don't look at it. Listen to a recording and see, and even if it's just like an 8 measure passage, write down what you think you're hearing, even if it's a reduction or if you're doing the full orchestration, and then get out the book and see how you did. So you said you did that with Beethoven, right?
I did it with Beethoven. I did it with Debussy's Nocturnes, the Nuage, the Fete, and Sirens. Yeah, I worked with those. And the reason I chose those is because they were the least busy.
Yeah.
It was particularly Les Nuages. It had these very transparent colors and sounds. And I basically taught myself how to write like Debussy doing that.
Hmm.
Another one I did was with Richard Strauss. Now, I warn people with Richard Strauss, if you're a beginning writer, you don't want to study him in the beginning because his later works, there's so much polyphony, there's all this fantastic orchestration. You can certainly learn a lot, but you're not going to be writing pieces like that very often because that's virtuoso orchestra writing. And most groups, like where we live, they're not going to have the time to learn music that difficult. But if you take his first symphonic poem, Aus Italien,
Mhm.
which is a four movement tone poem, and it sounds more like Mendelssohn on steroids. It's a much larger group orchestra, and there's a third movement in there, which is called it's the Andantino,
Mhm.
and it has the muted strings, and it has a very dreamy cascading effect, and it's so transparent that you can attempt to write it by listening to it.
Nice.
And it isn't overly polyphonic either. So
Right.
I've done that with that work. And of course, I earlier before Beethoven, I did that with some Haydn and Mozart before I got hold of the scores.
Right.
But
Now, I want to go back to something that you told me a long time ago, and you've kind of mentioned it before, talking about, for beginners getting into orchestration. I don't know if you were quoting something you said or if you were making an observation yourself, but it was advice to a young composer that you said, if you'll study the Beethoven symphonies, you'll learn all you need to know about basic orchestration. Do you still stand by that opinion?
I do. I do because all of the modern music that we have today, it traces all back to Beethoven, at least in Western music,
Yes.
traces all back to Beethoven. And Beethoven is where he's basically the founder of the modern orchestra.
Mhm.
Everything has come from that. Prior to that, when you look at other composers, Haydn and Mozart, they're more focused on material
Yeah.
and structure than they are orchestration. And some of their symphonies, as they go, some symphonies are better than others. They'll have like three great symphonies, and then they'll have some that they probably didn't have a lot of time to work on, and they'll then five more great ones, and then two that sound like they wrote them 20 years ago.
Mhm.
And the progression is up and down. Well, with Beethoven, he starts with his first symphony, and from there, he takes that and then he expands on it in his second, and he expands on his third, and his fourth, and his fifth, and his sixth, and his seventh. And so, my recommendation is start with the first one,
Mhm.
learn how Beethoven wrote as he learned to write,
Yeah.
and start from the beginning and do it in sequential order from symphony number one all the way up to symphony number nine.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to the ninth symphony, you'll know so much about Beethoven you won't be overwhelmed with trying to digest the last symphony.
Right.
A lot of people say, well, I just like to get the last works of every composer because it's a summary of all their knowledge. Well, yes, but you can do that. And if you're like got this mindset for it, go ahead. It's not wrong, but I can't do it that way.
Yeah.
So I'll start from the beginning and go all the way to the end of the line. So, and to me, Beethoven, it's kind of like an actor studying theater. You wouldn't become an actor or be a playwright without studying Shakespeare.
Yeah.
That's where it's all that's where it's all learned.
Yeah.
And so it's that equivalent.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of Beethoven, I don't know if we really touched on this. I've only done this with symphonies 1, 3, 5, and I think maybe 6. I think I've done it 1, 3, 5, and 6. Done a complete Roman numeral analysis of every harmony in the piece. And that was my first kind of self-education project after graduating from all of schools, and I wanted to keep that part fresh, so that is something else that you can do. So one of the questions that I shared with you in advance, and I want to go ahead and ask, is what is one or two things, what are a few things that you would say that you learned from score study about composing or orchestration that you otherwise would not have learned from the classes you took?
The first thing I did was I learned how to create color, texture, and sounds that you couldn't learn in an orchestration method book or in a classroom. They're just questions that the teacher can't answer.
Mhm.
But if you go to the scores, that attract you the most, the music that really inspires you, it's like asking the composer themselves
Right.
and saying, "Hey, how did you do this?" "Well, here, this is how I solved this problem." Pull out his score, and he would just show it to you. Well, you're already doing that. It's just like he's done that. So he's teaching you long after he's dead.
Yep.
And then you can take that, and then I would copy it, and then I would try to create something like that
Mhm.
to where I could remember the skills
Yeah.
by reapplying it. One example of that is in Richard Strauss's Don Quixote
Yeah.
in Variation 7, there's a big storm and sequence in there.
Mhm.
And it's got the wind machine, and it's got the chromatic ascending and descending lines and the strings and the woodwinds. And it just sounds like it's this beautiful storm.
Yeah.
And I've used that technique on certain occasions on some of my own arrangements and in music that I've done. The second thing would be how to take marginal ideas that you may have or need to use and make them sound great with good orchestration.
Right.
Now, getting back to Beethoven, one of the reasons I think Beethoven is a genius is because he has some of the greatest ideas ever, and he has some of the worst ideas ever.
Mm.
Well, like the Fifth Symphony,
Yeah.
bum 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 bum,
Mhm.
4 notes. If that guy came into my studio back then and said, "Okay, I have these 4 notes. I'm going to write a symphony," I would just laugh at him and go, "You're going to write a symphony with that? How?" And then he would go off and write the symphony and just show everybody how great he was.
Yep.
Another one, Beethoven Symphony Number 3. Bum, 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 bum. Not my favorite idea.
Right.
But what does he do with it? He develops the ideas, and then he has this great orchestration that hides any of the things that he might not have liked about it.
Yeah.
And that's use of orchestration.
Right.
The third one is doing more with less and with limited instrumentation.
Right.
And I learned that through the film scoring classes that we took. Not always having the instruments that you need or the
Right.
sounds that you require, and pushing forward with what you have. And you really find that you'd be amazed
Right.
at how good some of these things sound that you didn't think would sound because you didn't have what you originally thought you wanted.
Right. Okay, so the next thing is, you've mentioned a few things. You mentioned Als Italien by Richard Strauss, but what are just some scores, however many you want to name, that you'd recommend that, people trying to study orchestration or composition, trying to get better at it? I mean, we'll just go ahead. I'll go ahead and just start you off. All nine symphonies of Beethoven. We said that. What are some other
Right.
scores you'd recommend?
Okay. Well, mind you, when I'm saying this, I'm recommend people who are more on the early stages of orchestration. I mean, obviously, for advanced writers, there's different music, but I would say all three Debussy nocturnes,
Hmm.
um, the Richard Strauss Faust Italien, all four movements, Don Quixote because it's theme and variations,
Yeah.
and and he's taking the theme and using orchestration to help with that. Um, and Bernstein's symphonic dances from West Side Story, because you're using the expanded 20th extended harmony 20th century technique. Well, actually, it's not 20th century. It's more Debussy came up with this,
Yes.
and using that in a jazz setting and orchestral setting, because Bernstein often combined the two in a lot of his earlier writings.
Right.
And so that's a good one. But of course, if you're the advanced orchestrator, by all means, go through Stravinsky's music. Um,
Yeah,
go
I will jump
through
on that. So for Stravinsky, if you're like, I'm ready to start doing that, I will say the Firebird is very accessible. You'll see a lot of interesting things like, very early on, he has the cellos glissandoing, but only by doing harmonics. It's just catching all of the partials as it goes up and down. It's a really interesting effect. But I think Stravinsky progresses faster than anybody other than maybe the Beatles in music history in terms of
Yeah.
styles. Petrushka is already a lot harder to decipher, and the Rite of Spring, you really have to be patient with that. But the nice thing
One
about Rite of Spring, though, real quick, is Stravinsky did a two piano version of it, so you can harmonically see what's happening.
Yeah, I don't have this two piano, but I have the orchestra version.
Yeah,
But what I would say, what I've learned with basically it's all music, but particularly with 20th century music, because the harmonic and language and structure is different because composers were getting tired of the 19th century chord progressions, and chromaticism was just, there was no place to go with chromaticism. And then you had Schoenberg come up with his 12 tone, where musical democracy, where all the notes in the scale were important,
yeah,
and coming up with a whole new blend and texture. And so I would say for somebody studying, you need to first digest what you're hearing,
yeah.
and not looking at it like dissonance, whether he has seventh chords or augmented chords or chordals. You're looking basically at what music essentially is. It's organized tension and resolution.
Mhm.
And no matter, when you're looking at all the great music, no matter what period, whether it's Monteverdi with his seventh chords, which he was nearly persecuted over, the functional dominant seventh chord, to anything by Stravinsky or Stockhausen or Schoenberg, Webern, they don't escape the tension and resolution.
Yeah.
And when you figure out where that is in the music and how that works, when you open up your score and you start studying it, knowing how it functions, it's much easier to digest.
All right. So yeah, we just about reached the end of our time, and it's been great chatting with you about this once again after all this time. Um, if anyone would like to, get your input on things regarding score study or anything else compositional, where can they reach you?
Well, they can reach me at my email, and that's ajcallo, AJCALLO .ac@gmail.com. Or if they have Facebook, they can message me. I'm under Andrew Callo. There's more than one. I'm not the one in Hawaii.
And I will say, if you go to the Facebook page, hope you like trains. You have always been, as long as I've been a train enthusiast.
Mhm.
And and in fact, my wife was just asking the other day, it's like, is he still into trains? I was like, pretty sure he
Yep.
is.
Yeah, pretty sure. Pretty sure. Yes, I wrote a whole symphony for a community out in California that was inspired by a train. Um, it's called Eagle Mountain Portrait,
Hmm.
and that was the symphony that they had the premiere, and I was interviewed on the radio, local radio station over here, and it
Nice.
was for a town in California. It was called Eagle Mountain. They were an iron ore mountain town, corporate town, out in the middle of the desert, and they mined iron ore until the mine closed in 1983, and the town has been a ghost town ever since. But there's a very active and vibrant online community. And one time I was out there following the rails. They had a train that went up there, and I saw the town and saw it was a ghost town, and it got me so curious. And I started getting in touch with these people, and they were telling me their stories. And next thing you know, a whole symphony came out of it.
Nice. Yeah, and I have heard it. It's a very good job, great piece. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for chatting with me today. For some people, this might be a little bit nerdy as far as the topic goes, but I do think if you want to really dive into musicianship, you got to see what's on the written score, and you've given us a lot of ideas to to go exploring. So thank you. And that just about finishes up episode 16. One final note from our conversation: soon after we were done recording, Andrew shared with me that he actually had prepared quite a few thoughts that we didn't get around to, and he wrote them down and he shared them with me, and I put that on a PDF document on my website that is linked in the show notes if you want to go ahead and check that out. As always, if you haven't already, I want to encourage you to check out Fonz, as I've been doing for nearly a year now. It is an online platform that you can use to schedule all of your students, change the schedule easily for either on your by you doing it or the students doing it. Also, and you can set it up however you want according to your policies, whether you take makeups or, whether you they have to cancel 24 hours in advance, or whether you just don't, there's no cancellation policy. You can set it up according to your policy, and you can set your own rates. You can also be sure of several things. When it's time for your student or your client's appointment or lesson, because again, you can do this for music or you can do it for martial arts, yoga, being a personal trainer, whatever it is. Well, you can be sure if you and your clients are on Fonz, that they are going to get a reminder from the app about their time with reasonable notice. There's not that, oh, I forgot. As long as they check their emails or their text messages, they'll get that reminder. And likewise, you can sync it to your calendar so you don't have to forget either. If you look at your calendar each day, each morning, which hopefully you should, you'll see your lessons for the day listed there. And then and you're like, oh, I forgot, I got to change it. Well, you can go into the app and you can cancel it and they will get a notification, but you can also include a message with that. So this is just one of the things that the app does, and it takes care of the payment for you. And there's a free trial for the app so that you don't have anything to lose by giving it a try. So check out that link in today's show notes and also of any of the previous episodes. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much, and I would appreciate it if you haven't already, if you would make sure to follow me and to subscribe and to like this video. If you are listening on a podcast, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you'll follow to automatically be able to know about any future episodes. And you can follow me on social media where I post about the podcast on TikTok or Instagram at David Lane Music, on Facebook at David M. Lane Music. And again, I'm on YouTube, if you haven't checked that out already, at David Lane Music 1. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and there will be another episode for you next week.